Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in.
3 months after my divorce, I was still sleeping on my younger brother's couch in Milwaukee. Every morning, I'd fold the blanket before he came downstairs, partly out of gratitude and partly because I hated being reminded that a 34-year-old man had somehow ended up back where he started. My brother never complained about having me there. If anything, he went out of his way to make it feel temporary. But temporary had started turning into routine. I'd wake up around 6, make coffee in the same chipped mug I'd been using since college, scroll through job listings on my phone, and convince myself that today would be different. Most days, it wasn't. I'd send out applications, call places that never called back, check my bank account more often than I wanted to admit. My savings had taken a beating during the divorce. Lawyer fees, deposits, the cost of starting over from scratch. By the end of each week, it felt like I was performing magic tricks just to stretch what little money I had left. The worst part wasn't losing the house. It wasn't even signing the divorce papers. It was realizing how quickly the future you'd spent years building could disappear. 1 minute, you're arguing over paint colors for the guest bedroom. The next, you're sleeping on a pull-out couch wondering if you'll ever be able to afford your own place again. That Tuesday afternoon, I was helping my brother change the oil in his old Ford F-150 when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown Chicago number. I almost ignored it. The last thing I wanted was another conversation involving lawyers. I'd had enough of legal offices to last a lifetime. But when the call went to voicemail, something made me listen to it. The man introduced himself as an estate attorney, representing the family of a recently deceased client. According to him, I had been named as the sole beneficiary in my great-uncle's will. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it didn't make sense. I barely knew anyone on my father's side of the family. My dad had passed away when I was 12, and whatever connections existed after that slowly faded over the years. The attorney asked if I could come to Chicago later that week. There were documents that required my signature. I asked him what exactly had been left to me. There was a brief pause before he answered. "A residential property," he said. "An apartment building." I stared at my brother across the driveway. My hands were covered in motor oil. I had less than $400 in my checking account. I was sleeping on someone else's couch. And apparently, I owned an apartment building in Chicago. My brother wiped the motor oil from his hands with an old shop rag and stared at me from across the driveway. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Somewhere down the block, a lawn mower droned beneath the late afternoon sun. A dog barked behind a wooden fence. Ordinary sounds, the kind that faded into the background until life gave you a reason to notice them again. "You are serious," he said. I glanced down at my phone. "I think so." He shook his head slowly. "I mean, who leaves an apartment building to somebody they barely know? Apparently my family has been making strange decisions without consulting me." That earned a small laugh from both of us. It was brief, but real. We finished changing the oil in silence. Neither of us knew what to say after that. Later that evening, I packed a small overnight bag using whatever clean clothes I could find. I folded shirts carefully, rolled socks together, placed my toothbrush inside an old travel case that had survived my marriage somehow. Temporary situations had a way of becoming permanent if you stopped paying attention. Before going to bed, I checked my bank account again. $374. That number had become familiar enough to greet me each morning like an unwelcome roommate. I lay awake longer than usual that night. My mind kept returning to the same question. Why me? I barely remembered Theodore Mercer. I remembered attending a family gathering when I was young. Somebody tall had handed me a toy airplane. There had been laughter in another room, the smell of cigarette smoke drifting through an open screen door. Beyond that, nothing. Yet somehow that man had changed my life from beyond the gray. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies, and the smell of coffee drifting through my brother's kitchen. He handed me a travel mug before I left. If this turns out to be some elaborate scam, "Do not give them your social security number," he said. I smiled. "If it turns out to be haunted, I will let you investigate first." He laughed. It was good hearing that sound. I had not contributed much to the household recently beyond dishes and grocery runs. The drive toward Chicago took just under 2 hours. Traffic thickened steadily as the city approached. Concrete replaced trees. Steel replaced open fields. By the time I found parking near the attorney's office, my shoulders ached from gripping the steering wheel. The law office looked exactly how I imagined it would. Marble floors, muted artwork, receptionists speaking softly into telephones. Richard Bennett greeted me personally. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and maintained the calm demeanor of someone who had delivered both good news and terrible news throughout his career. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Mercer," he said. "I still think there has been some mistake," I replied. He offered a sympathetic smile. "That reaction has become fairly common this week." We spent nearly an hour reviewing documents. Theodore Mercer had passed away 6 weeks earlier following complications from a stroke. Ownership of Blackwood Apartments transferred directly to me under the terms of his will. There were signatures requiring attention, financial summaries, property records, insurance information. Eventually, Richard placed a heavy ring of brass keys on the desk between us. "These belong to Theodore," he said. I picked them up carefully. They felt heavier than expected. "You will not be handling daily operations alone," Richard continued. "The building manager has worked there for many years. She oversees most responsibilities." That provided some comfort. "Can I ask why Theodore chose me?" I said. Richard adjusted his glasses. He never explained his reasoning. He simply insisted that ownership transferred directly to you. The answer satisfied nothing. An hour later, I stood outside Blackwood Apartments. I expected sleek architecture and expensive glass facades. Instead, the building looked rooted firmly in another era. Red brick stretched upward across 8 stories. Black iron fire escapes zigzagged along the exterior walls. Decorative stone gargoyles occupied the roofline corners. The sign above the entrance displayed elegant gold lettering. Slightly faded. Blackwood Apartments. I remained on the sidewalk for several moments. This place belonged to me, at least temporarily. The lobby surprised me immediately. Hardwood floors reflected warm lighting. Comfortable seating occupied one corner. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Residents moved naturally through the space. Nobody behaved strangely. A woman wearing hospital scrubs balanced takeout containers against one hip. An older man struggled with reusable grocery bags. A teenager hurried toward the elevator carrying what appeared to be a cello case. Normal people. Ordinary routines. Margaret Doyle introduced herself before uncertainty convinced me to leave. "You must be Ethan," she said. Silver hair framed a thoughtful expression. She wore practical shoes and carried a clipboard thick with paperwork. "Nice to meet you," I said. Margaret studied my face. "You resemble Theodore more than you realize." I had no idea how to respond. Margaret spent the next hour introducing me to Blackwood Apartments. Laundry facilities occupied part of the basement. Administrative offices remained near the lobby. 43 units currently housed long-term residents. Theodore believed stability mattered. Margaret explained, "The people here appreciated consistency." She spoke about Theodore respectfully. Residents trusted him. Vendors respected him. Maintenance schedules had been followed meticulously for years. By late afternoon, my stomach reminded me that coffee did not qualify as lunch. Margaret recommended a nearby diner. I ordered a cheeseburger and researched apartment management responsibilities through internet articles while waiting for my food. The results accomplished little beyond increasing my anxiety. Lease agreements, budget oversight, conflict resolution, emergency planning. I possessed experience in none of those areas. Returning to Blackwood afterward felt strangely comfortable. Margaret handed me additional paperwork. "Theodore maintained a residence on the 8th floor," she said. "You are welcome to stay there while you decide what comes next." I thanked her sincerely. Hotel expenses were difficult to justify given my financial situation. The elevator carried me upward without incident. Theodore's apartment exceeded expectations. Bookshelves lined one wall. Framed photographs occupied nearly every surface. Everything appeared orderly, intentional, like somebody expected to return shortly. I unpacked slowly. Toothbrush beside the sink, phone charger near the bed. Fresh clothes folded carefully across a chair. Outside, city lights emerged against the darkening skyline. For the first time in months, optimism surfaced cautiously. Maybe Blackwood represented opportunity. Maybe selling the building could provide enough financial stability to rebuild my life. Around 9 o'clock, restlessness encouraged exploration. The hallway beyond Theodore's apartment remained warmly lit. Television sounds drifted faintly beneath closed doors. Water pipes shifted somewhere behind the walls. Halfway down the corridor, a middle-aged resident emerged carrying grocery bags. "You must be Theodore's nephew," he said. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Margaret mentioned your arrival," he said. Residents thought highly of Theodore. That was comforting to hear, even if I barely understood who Theodore had been. The man hesitated briefly. He looked like somebody debating whether to continue speaking. Instead, he wished me good evening and disappeared into his apartment. I resumed walking toward Theodore's residence. "Excuse me," somebody said behind me. I turned. An elderly woman stood near her doorway. "You are the new owner," she said. Apparently, her expression softened. Theodore was a good man. "I hope you settle in comfortably." "Thank you," I said. She nodded slowly. "Did Margaret explain everything?" "Everything," I repeated. "About the building," she clarified. "Not really. We mostly discussed maintenance responsibilities." Confusion crossed her face. Before she could respond, another resident stepped into the hallway nearby. "Everything all right, Helen?" he asked. Helen glanced between us. "Yes," she said. "Of course." The man shifted his attention toward me. Concern appeared almost immediately in his expression. "Margaret never gave you Theodore's instructions," he said. I frowned. "Instructions regarding what?" The man hesitated. Helen lowered her voice. "Regarding the rules," she said quietly. I stared at both of them. The hallway suddenly felt smaller than it had moments earlier. "What rules?" I asked. Neither of them answered immediately. Instead, they exchanged the kind of glance shared by people who realized something important had been overlooked. Helen looked toward Theodore's apartment, then back toward me. "If Margaret truly forgot," she said, "perhaps you should speak with her first thing tomorrow morning." "About what, exactly?" Helen pressed her lips together. "About how things work at Blackwood Apartments." The man beside her nodded once. Theodore always made sure new residents understood. Understood what? Helen offered a strained smile. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." Before I could ask another question, both residents retreated into their apartments. Their doors closed softly behind them. I remained alone in the hallway beneath warm lighting and distant television sounds. Ordinary details, ordinary surroundings. Yet something subtle had shifted. I looked toward Theodore's apartment at the far end of the corridor. Then toward the elevator. Questions circled endlessly through my thoughts as I walked back toward the only place inside Blackwood that currently belonged to me. Somewhere behind one of those apartment doors, residents continued eating dinner, watching television, and preparing for work the next morning. Life carried on as usual. Yet as I unlocked Theodore's apartment and stepped inside, one thought refused to leave. Why would an apartment building need rules important enough that people assumed everyone already knew them? I stood inside Theodore's apartment for several minutes after closing the door behind me. The silence felt different now. Before speaking with Helen, the apartment had seemed comforting, familiar, despite belonging to someone I barely remembered. Now, every framed photograph and carefully arranged bookshelf carried an uncomfortable weight. I set Theodore's keys on the kitchen counter and walked through the apartment again. Nothing appeared unusual. The furniture remained exactly where I had first seen it. A folded blanket rested neatly across the sofa. Several books sat stacked beside an armchair positioned near the window. Somebody had lived here for years. Somebody who apparently believed apartment buildings required rules important enough to pass between residents. I checked the time on my phone. 9:42 in the evening. Margaret had probably gone home hours earlier. I considered calling my brother. He would almost certainly tell me I had inherited a building full of eccentric tenants. Chicago was a large city. Older buildings developed traditions. Residents invented stories. Maybe Theodore had encouraged harmless rituals that strengthened the sense of community. The explanation sounded reasonable. I held on to it. Around 10 o'clock, I made coffee despite knowing it would keep me awake longer. Sleep felt unlikely anyway. My thoughts kept circling back toward Helen's expression. She had not looked amused. She had looked concerned. I carried the mug into Theodore's study. The room occupied one corner of the apartment. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Shelves overflowed with maintenance records and tenant files. Theodore had been organized. Extremely organized. Each drawer carried handwritten labels, utility contracts, insurance documents, vendor agreements. I spent nearly an hour reviewing paperwork related to Blackwood Apartments. Everything appeared normal. Routine inspections had been completed regularly. Maintenance expenses remained consistent. Resident complaints involved leaky faucets and malfunctioning appliances. Nothing suggested hidden danger. Eventually, fatigue encouraged me to stop searching. I prepared for bed shortly before 11. Outside, city traffic had diminished considerably. Occasional headlights moved across neighboring buildings. The apartment remained comfortably warm. I brushed my teeth and changed into sleep clothes. Then I paused beside the bedroom doorway. A narrow bookshelf stood against the hallway wall. Several framed photographs occupied the upper shelves. Theodore appeared in many of them, sometimes alone, occasionally alongside residents from Blackwood. One photograph caught my attention immediately. Theodore stood beside Margaret near the lobby entrance. Both looked considerably younger. Theodore held a clipboard beneath one arm. Margaret smiled toward the camera. Behind them, partially obscured by decorations, hung a framed notice board. I moved closer. The image quality made reading difficult. Still, several typed lines remained visible beneath the glass. Theodore had framed something important enough to display publicly. I returned the photograph to its place and climbed into bed. Sleep arrived slowly. The unfamiliar apartment contributed partially. So did the persistent awareness that tomorrow morning would determine the direction of my future. I eventually drifted into shallow sleep sometime after midnight. A sound woke me. I opened my eyes immediately. Complete darkness surrounded the bedroom. For several seconds, confusion clouded my thoughts. Then memory returned. Chicago, Blackwood Apartments, Theodore's apartment. The sound came again. Footsteps. Soft, rhythmic, moving somewhere beyond the bedroom walls. I checked my phone. 1:23 in the morning. Apartment buildings contained other residents. People worked night shifts. People returned home late. There was nothing unusual about footsteps in a residential building. I closed my eyes again. The footsteps continued briefly before fading. Silence settled across the apartment once more. Morning arrived later than expected. Sunlight filtered through partially closed curtains. My phone displayed 8:15. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, searching for Margaret. The lobby appeared busier than it had the previous evening. Residents moved through morning routines carrying coffee cups and work bags. Somebody argued softly into a telephone near the entrance. Margaret occupied the management office reviewing paperwork. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "Did you sleep well?" "More or less." I hesitated briefly. Several residents mentioned something yesterday evening. Margaret looked upward. "What sort of something?" "Rules," I said. They seemed surprised that nobody had explained them. Margaret remained silent longer than expected. Then she removed her glasses carefully. "Theodore usually handled that conversation personally," she said. I waited. Margaret folded her hands atop the desk. "Blackwood has accumulated certain traditions throughout the years." "Traditions," I repeated. "Residents sometimes find comfort in routine." She chose her words carefully. Theodore respected that. I frowned slightly. Helen looked genuinely concerned. Margaret sighed quietly. "You have inherited more than property ownership, Ethan." People relied upon Theodore. He listened when others dismissed concerns. That answer explained nothing. Margaret opened one desk drawer. She removed a slim folder and placed it carefully before me. The cover displayed simple handwriting. Resident guidelines. I stared downward. "You are serious," I said. Margaret met my gaze directly. Theodore believed understanding the building mattered. I opened the folder slowly. Several typed pages rested inside. Neat, organized, practical in appearance. The first page addressed emergency maintenance procedures. Contact information followed. Fire safety guidelines occupied another section. Ordinary information. Then I turned another page. The formatting changed noticeably. The list contained only a handful of entries. Margaret watched silently from across the desk. I looked toward the first sentence. If you hear a child crying in the hallway after 11 o'clock at night, remain inside your apartment until the sound stops. I glanced upward immediately. Margaret maintained the same expression. The next line continued beneath it. No residents under 16 years of age have lived at Blackwood Apartments since 1987. I closed the folder. What exactly is this? I asked. Margaret leaned back carefully. Theodore called them precautions. Precautions against what? Margaret studied the office window before responding. That depends upon whom you ask. I looked down toward the folder again. The typed pages waited patiently beneath my hands. Every rational explanation I had constructed since arriving at Blackwood began weakening around the edges. Apartment buildings did not require precautions involving crying children who should not exist. I swallowed hard. Then I opened the folder once more. The second guideline appeared beneath the first. If somebody knocks exactly 3 times between midnight and 3 in the morning, do not answer the door. My eyes moved lower across the page. If the knocking becomes 5 consecutive knocks, secure your bedroom door and remain inside until sunrise. I looked up from the folder. Margaret remained completely still behind her desk. This cannot be serious, I said. Margaret adjusted several papers resting near her elbow. Theodore believed it was serious enough to document, she replied. Did you believe it? Margaret considered the question carefully. I believed Theodore. That answer frustrated me more than I expected. Believing a person was different from believing. Impossible things happened inside an apartment building. I closed the folder again. Has anyone actually experienced any of this? I asked. Margaret hesitated. Blackwood residents have lived here for decades. People develop habits. Some habits survive because nobody wants to test the alternatives. That sounded uncomfortably close to avoiding my question. I left the management office carrying the folder beneath my arm. Residents continued moving through the lobby as if nothing unusual existed within these walls. Somebody collected a food delivery near the entrance. 2 elderly residents discussed weekend weather forecasts beside the mailboxes. A maintenance worker pushed a cart loaded with supplies across the polished floor. Everything appeared ordinary. The contrast unsettled me. I returned to Theodore's apartment shortly before noon. Sunlight streamed through the windows, overlooking Chicago streets below. Traffic moved steadily between intersections. Construction crews worked several blocks away. Normal sounds. Normal people. I placed the folder on Theodore's kitchen table and prepared coffee. Then I opened it again. The third guideline occupied half a page. If you notice somebody standing at the far end of the hallway who disappears when you blink, return immediately to your apartment. If you see the same figure again in the same location, do not acknowledge that you recognize its presence. I rubbed my temples slowly. Somebody had typed these instructions carefully. Somebody had preserved them for years. Theodore had apparently believed they mattered enough to share with residents. I walked through the apartment again searching for explanations. Maybe Theodore enjoyed local folklore. Perhaps the guidelines functioned as elaborate traditions meant to strengthen community identity. Blackwood Apartments occupied an older building. Older places accumulated stories. That explanation remained imperfect, yet comforting. Around 1 o'clock, I called my brother. He answered during his lunch break. "How is life as a wealthy landlord?" he asked. I glanced toward the folder resting nearby. Strange, I admitted. Strange how? The residents have rules. My brother laughed softly. Rules about what? I hesitated. Apartment things, I said eventually. He accepted the vague answer more easily than expected. Before ending the call, he reminded me to avoid signing documents without reading them carefully. Practical advice. Familiar advice. After hanging up, I spent several hours reviewing Blackwood records again. Maintenance logs remained ordinary. Financial reports appeared stable. Tenant histories reflected years of predictable concerns. Nobody documented supernatural encounters through official channels. Evening approached gradually. Shadows lengthened across Theodore's apartment. Hunger eventually forced me downstairs toward the diner Margaret had recommended. The waitress recognized me immediately. Theodore always ordered the meatloaf special on Thursdays, she said. I considered changing my order. Instead, curiosity won. Meatloaf sounds fine, I replied. The food arrived alongside memories that did not belong to me. Theodore had apparently occupied a regular place within this neighborhood. People knew him, trusted him. I wondered how many of them understood the contents of the folder hidden upstairs. Returning to Blackwood shortly after 7, I found Helen collecting mail near the lobby. She noticed the folder beneath my arm immediately. Margaret spoke with you, Helen said quietly. Apparently she did. Helen studied my expression. Theodore never wanted newcomers frightened unnecessarily. That does not answer anything, I replied. Helen sighed softly. It is easier once you stop asking why. I stared at her. Easier than what? Helen gathered her letters carefully. Easier than learning what happens when people ignore good advice. Before I could continue the conversation, the elevator arrived behind her. Helen stepped inside without another word. I remained beside the mailboxes longer than intended. Eventually, I rode upward toward Theodore's apartment. The 8th floor hallway appeared identical to the previous evening. Warm lighting illuminated polished floors. Closed apartment doors lined both sides. Somebody laughed softly behind one wall. A television played somewhere farther down the corridor. Ordinary details. I unlocked Theodore's apartment and entered quietly. The folder waited where I had left it earlier. Against my better judgment, I opened it once more. The 4th guideline occupied the next page. If somebody calls your name from behind while you are using the stairwell after midnight, do not turn around. The voice may resemble somebody familiar. Continue moving until you reach your destination. My stomach tightened unexpectedly. The instructions remained absurd. Yet each guideline carried a consistent tone. Calm, practical, almost administrative. Theodore had not written them like ghost stories. He had written them like emergency procedures. By 10 o'clock, exhaustion encouraged an early bedtime. I brushed my teeth and changed into comfortable clothes before settling beneath unfamiliar blankets. Sleep arrived gradually. I dreamed about filing cabinets overflowing with brass keys and unsigned paperwork. A distant sound interrupted the dream. Knock, knock, knock. My eyes opened immediately. Darkness filled Theodore's bedroom. I remained motionless beneath the blankets. Perhaps another resident had visitors. Apartment buildings contained many doors, many lives. Silence followed. I exhaled slowly. Then the sound returned. Knock, knock, knock. The rhythm remained deliberate, controlled. I reached toward the nightstand searching for my phone. 1:14 in the morning. Another pause settled across the apartment. My heartbeat quickened despite repeated attempts at rational explanation. Somebody had likely approached the wrong apartment. Footsteps would follow shortly. The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I sat upright slowly. The sound originated nearby, very nearby. My gaze drifted toward the bedroom doorway. Theodore's apartment remained silent beyond those walls. I remembered the 2nd guideline resting inside the folder on the kitchen table. If somebody knocks exactly 3 times between midnight and 3 in the morning, do not answer the door. I almost laughed at myself. Fear had transformed typed nonsense into genuine anxiety. Still, I remained seated on the bed, listening, waiting. Another silence stretched across the apartment. Then came 5 measured knocks from somewhere beyond the front hallway. Slow, deliberate, impossible to mistake. I stared toward the bedroom entrance as cold realization settled heavily inside my chest. The second guideline had not ended after the first sentence. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed while the silence returned to the apartment. My heart pounded hard enough to make my chest ache. 5 knocks. Slow, deliberate, exactly as described in the folder resting on the kitchen table. I stared at the bedroom doorway. Every instinct urged me to walk into the hallway and confirm that somebody had been playing an elaborate joke. Another part of me remembered Helen's expression when she mentioned the rules. Fear looked very different from superstition. I climbed off the bed and crossed the bedroom quietly. The apartment remained completely silent. Moonlight filtered through the living room windows. Pale reflections stretched across polished hardwood floors. I stopped outside the bedroom doorway. The front entrance stood 30 feet away. Nothing appeared unusual. No shadows moved beneath the door. No voices drifted from the hallway outside. Common sense returned gradually. Apartment buildings produced strange sounds. Neighbors came and went at odd hours. Perhaps somebody had knocked on another door entirely. I took 2 steps toward the kitchen. A soft scraping noise emerged from the opposite side of the front door. I stopped immediately. The sound resembled fingertips moving slowly across painted wood. Not scratching, exploring. I backed away instinctively. Every hair along my arms stood upright. The folder remained open across the kitchen table. Moonlight illuminated the page describing the second guideline. Secure your bedroom door and remain inside until sunrise. I returned to the bedroom without hesitation. The apartment remained silent behind me. Once inside, I closed the bedroom door and locked it. The action felt ridiculous. It also felt necessary. I checked my phone. 1:22 in the morning. Several hours remained before sunrise. Sleep became impossible. I sat against the headboard listening carefully. Occasionally old pipes shifted within the walls. Distant traffic echoed faintly from city streets below. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. Around 2:15, footsteps crossed the hallway outside the bedroom. Slow. Measured. Somebody walking through the apartment. My breath caught immediately. I lived alone inside the 8th floor residence. Nobody else possessed keys, according to Richard Bennett. The footsteps paused outside the bedroom. Silence followed. Then came 3 gentle taps against the bedroom door. Not knocking, testing. I stared toward the darkness beyond the room. The doorknob remained still. Eventually, the footsteps resumed. They moved farther away. Toward the living room. Toward the front entrance. Another silence settled over the apartment. Exhaustion eventually overcame fear. I drifted into uneasy sleep shortly before dawn. Sunlight woke me several hours later. I remained motionless beneath the blankets, while memories from the previous night returned gradually. Part of me attempted rational explanations immediately. Dreams, stress, unfamiliar surroundings. I climbed from bed and opened the bedroom door cautiously. The apartment appeared exactly as I had left it. Dishes remained beside the sink. The folder still occupied the kitchen table. Sunlight filled every corner. I approached the front entrance slowly. Several faint streaks marked the painted surface near the doorknob. Thin, irregular, as though somebody had dragged dusty fingertips across the wood. My stomach tightened. I touched one mark carefully. Gray residue transferred onto my skin. I washed my hands immediately afterward. Margaret arrived at the management office shortly after 8. She looked up as I entered. "You look tired," she said. I placed the folder onto her desk. "Somebody knocked on my door last night," I replied. 3 times. Then 5. Margaret remained silent. I expected surprise, concern, disbelief. Instead, she removed her glasses carefully. "Did you open the door?" she asked. "No." "Did you leave the bedroom afterward?" I hesitated. "Not until morning." Margaret nodded slowly. "Good." Anger replaced fear momentarily. "Good. That is all you have to say." Margaret folded her hands together. "Ethan, Blackwood Apartments has existed for nearly a century. Many people have lived here. Some stayed briefly. Others remained for decades. The residents learned certain patterns. I leaned forward. What happens if somebody ignores the rules? Margaret studied the window behind me. Not everybody remained long enough to share their experiences, she said quietly. The answer settled heavily between us. I spent the remainder of the morning reviewing maintenance requests simply to occupy my thoughts. Leaking faucets, malfunctioning appliances, broken window latches. Ordinary responsibilities grounded me temporarily. Around lunchtime, Helen appeared outside the management office. She carried a small container wrapped carefully in cloth. "Chicken noodle soup," she said. "You look like somebody who forgot breakfast." I accepted the container gratefully. "Thank you." Helen hesitated before continuing. "Margaret told me about last night." I glanced downward. "I am beginning to think everybody here is insane." Helen smiled sadly. Many residents said the same thing once, before they stopped dismissing the rules. She lowered her voice. "The first experience changes people." I wanted details, explanations, proof. Helen offered none. Instead, she squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving. Late afternoon brought rain clouds across Chicago. Thunder rolled distantly beyond apartment windows. Residents hurried through the lobby carrying groceries and umbrellas. Life continued. Blackwood remained functional despite its secrets. Shortly after sunset, I returned to the 8th floor. Fatigue lingered behind my eyes. Fear lingered deeper. The folder waited exactly where I had left it. I opened it once more. The next guideline described the stairwell. If somebody calls your name from behind after midnight, do not turn around. Continue moving until you reach your destination. The practical wording disturbed me most. No dramatic language. No threats. Simple instructions. I closed the folder. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. I considered leaving Blackwood entirely. Returning to Milwaukee. Selling the building through Richard Bennett. Abandoning whatever responsibility Theodore had attempted to pass forward. Then I remembered my checking account balance. My brother's couch. The life waiting behind me. Blackwood represented more than inheritance. It represented opportunity. Around 11:30, I prepared for bed again. Anxiety transformed every routine action into deliberate preparation. I checked the bedroom lock twice. Verified my phone charger remained connected. Positioned a glass of water beside the bed. Outside, thunder faded gradually into the distance. Midnight arrived quietly. 1 o'clock followed. Exhaustion encouraged optimism. Perhaps the previous night had been coincidence. Perhaps fear had amplified ordinary events into something larger. A distant sound interrupted the thought. Crying. Soft at first. Almost impossible to identify. I sat upright immediately. The sound continued. Unmistakably belonging to a child. Tiny sobs echoed faintly through the hallway beyond the apartment door. I checked my phone automatically. 11 minutes past 11. The first guideline surfaced instantly within my memory. No residents under 16 years of age had lived at Blackwood since 1987. The crying continued outside, moving slowly along the corridor, stopping occasionally, beginning again. I remained seated on the bed while cold dread settled gradually through my chest. Somewhere beyond the apartment walls, a child who should not have existed was wandering the 8th floor hallway. The crying continued beyond the apartment door with an uneven rhythm that sounded painfully human. Each sob carried through the hallway with disturbing clarity. I remained seated on the bed while logic fought against instinct. Children did not live inside Blackwood apartments. Margaret had confirmed that fact. The resident guidelines had repeated it. Still, another part of me resisted accepting impossible explanations. Perhaps a visitor had brought a child into the building. Perhaps somebody had ignored the residency policies. The crying stopped abruptly. Silence filled the apartment once more. I checked my phone. 11:19 in the evening. My breathing sounded unusually loud inside the bedroom. Several seconds passed without further noise. Then soft footsteps crossed the hallway outside. They moved slowly. Small footsteps, hesitant footsteps. I gripped the edge of the mattress tightly. The first guideline returned immediately. If you hear a child crying outside the hallway after 11 o'clock at night, remain inside your apartment. The footsteps stopped near my front door. Another silence followed. I stared toward the bedroom entrance while counting each heartbeat. Eventually, the footsteps resumed. They moved farther down the hallway. Relief spread gradually through my chest. I climbed from the bed and approached the bedroom doorway cautiously. The apartment remained dark except for faint city light filtering through distant windows. I took several careful steps toward the living room. Curiosity proved difficult to ignore. I stopped beside the front entrance. Complete silence waited beyond the door. Common sense urged restraint. Another part of me wanted proof that the rules represented nothing more than superstition. I leaned closer toward the peephole. My hand stopped midway through the movement. Another guideline surfaced unexpectedly. Never look through the peephole after 2 o'clock in the morning. I glanced toward my phone again. 11:24. Technically safe according to the rules. Technically. I stepped backward instead. The decision surprised me. Several days earlier, I would have dismissed the guidelines immediately. Now hesitation came naturally. I returned toward the bedroom. Sleep remained impossible. I settled into the living room armchair with a blanket draped across my shoulders. The folder rested nearby atop the coffee table. Midnight arrived quietly. Rain tapped occasionally against distant windows. Somewhere within the building, a television played faintly before falling silent. Blackwood Apartments returned gradually to stillness. Shortly after 1 o'clock, my phone vibrated unexpectedly. My brother had sent a text asking whether Chicago treated me well. I responded carefully. Interesting place. Strange residents. Good food. He replied with several jokes about eccentric landlords before wishing me good night. The exchange grounded me temporarily. Ordinary conversations still existed beyond Blackwood. Around 1:45, exhaustion finally began overcoming anxiety. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing minute. Then a muffled crash echoed somewhere below the apartment. I sat upright immediately. Another sound followed. Distant shouting. I moved toward the front entrance cautiously. Residents emerged into the 8th floor hallway outside. Worried voices drifted through closed doors. I opened my apartment carefully. Helen stood several feet away wearing a robe over her nightclothes. She noticed me instantly. "Stay upstairs," she said quietly. "What happened?" Helen hesitated. Somebody ignored the elevator rule. Cold unease settled heavily through my stomach. The elevator rule involved the non-existent 9th floor. Another resident hurried toward the stairwell. Margaret appeared moments later from the opposite direction. "Everybody return to your apartments," she instructed. "Nobody visits the lobby tonight." Her tone allowed no argument. Residents obeyed immediately. Helen retreated toward her apartment without another word. I stepped back inside Theodora's residence and locked the door. Sleep became impossible again. Dawn arrived slowly after an endless night. I headed downstairs shortly after sunrise. Exhaustion lingered behind my eyes. The lobby looked different, quieter. Several residents avoided eye contact entirely. Margaret occupied her office reviewing paperwork. Her expression appeared older than usual. "Somebody ignored the elevator rule," I said. Margaret removed her glasses. "A young resident returned home late last night." According to witnesses, the elevator stopped unexpectedly. On the 9th floor, I lowered myself into a nearby chair. Blackwood only has 8 floors. Margaret nodded. "That fact changes nothing." "What happened to him?" Margaret remained silent briefly. "Nobody has seen him since." Fear settled deeper than before. Disappearances belonged inside horror films, rather than apartment buildings. Yet nobody around me questioned the reality of the situation. Everybody simply accepted it. Helen entered the office carrying fresh coffee for Margaret. She offered me a sympathetic glance. "Theodore spent years trying to understand why the rules existed," Helen said quietly. "Did he succeed?" "Not completely. He discovered patterns. People survived when they listened." The statement echoed inside my thoughts long afterward. Later that afternoon, I returned to Theodore's study searching for answers. Filing cabinets lined the walls exactly as before. Maintenance records occupied most drawers. Eventually, I discovered a locked compartment near the bottom. The brass keys Richard Bennett had given me rested nearby. After several attempts, one key turned successfully. Inside waited a collection of notebooks bound with worn leather covers. Theodore's handwriting filled every page. Observations, resident accounts, dates stretching back decades. One entry caught my attention immediately. 1992. Resident reported crying child outside apartment 4 days before elevator incident. Another entry followed. 1998. Hallway figure observed twice before stairwell encounter. Additional notes connected each guideline through recurring events. Theodore had spent years documenting patterns, not folklore, evidence. I continued reading until evening shadows stretched across the study floor. One final notebook contained a message addressed directly to me. If you are reading this, Blackwood belongs to you now. I wished circumstances had allowed a proper introduction. The building protects those who respect its boundaries. Never mistake familiarity for safety. Blackwood waits patiently for complacency. My hands trembled slightly while holding the notebook. Theodore had anticipated this moment. Somehow he had expected another Mercer to continue his work. Night settled gradually across Chicago. City lights illuminated the windows beyond the study. I prepared dinner mechanically while replaying Theodore's words repeatedly. Blackwood waits patiently for complacency. Around 10:30, a soft knock sounded against the apartment door. Exactly 2 knocks. Ordinary knocks. I approached cautiously before opening the door. Margaret stood outside holding another folder beneath one arm. "The next set of records," she said. "You should read them tonight." I accepted the folder slowly. What exactly was Theodore trying to understand? Margaret studied the hallway briefly before meeting my gaze. Why Blackwood chooses certain people. Before I could ask another question, she turned away. I closed the apartment door and carried the folder toward the kitchen table. Handwritten labels marked each section carefully. Witness statements, incident reports, unresolved cases. Near the bottom rested a sealed envelope bearing my name in Theodore's unmistakable handwriting. Outside the apartment, something moved through the hallway with soft, deliberate footsteps. Then came the unmistakable sound of somebody calling my name from the stairwell. I froze beside the kitchen table while my name echoed faintly from the stairwell beyond the apartment door. The voice sounded familiar, calm, male. For one dangerous second, it reminded me of my brother. Then another memory surfaced immediately. If somebody calls your name from behind in the stairwell after midnight, do not turn around. Do not acknowledge them. Continue moving until you reach your destination. I checked the clock on the microwave. 12:14 in the morning. My mouth went dry. "Ethan." The voice came again. Closer this time. Not louder, just closer. The sealed envelope remained in my hands. Theodore's handwriting stared back at me from the front. I backed away from the apartment entrance carefully. The logical part of my brain wanted explanations. Neighbors, acoustics, sleep deprivation. Yet logic had started losing ground inside Blackwood Apartments. I carried the envelope into Theodore's study and closed the door behind me. The voice stopped immediately. Silence settled across the apartment. I stood there for several seconds before finally breaking the seal. Inside rested 3 folded sheets of paper. Theodore's handwriting covered every line. "If you are reading this letter, Blackwood has accepted you as its caretaker. I wish I could tell you that ownership is optional. It is not. You may leave the building physically. Blackwood rarely allows its caretakers to leave permanently." I lowered the letter. The statement sounded ridiculous. Unfortunately, Theodore's earlier notes had sounded ridiculous as well. He had also been correct. I continued reading. The rules preserve balance. Most residents never understand their purpose. They only know survival depends upon obedience. I spent decades searching for answers. I discovered fragments. Blackwood does not create these occurrences. It contains them. The building existed before the neighborhood around it. Some residents believe the land was cursed. Others believe the building itself developed awareness through tragedy. I found evidence supporting neither theory completely. What matters is this. Patterns are changing. The incidents have become more frequent, more aggressive. The caretaker remains responsible for maintaining order. A sharp knock interrupted my reading. 3 measured knocks against the apartment door. My entire body tensed immediately. 3 knocks. After midnight, I folded Theodore's letter carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Silence followed. Then came another sequence. 5 deliberate knocks. The sound echoed through the apartment like distant gunfire. I backed away from the study entrance automatically. The second guideline returned with terrifying clarity. If the knocking changes to 5 consecutive knocks, secure the bedroom and remain there until sunrise. I hurried toward Theodore's bedroom. Another series of 5 knocks followed. Slow, patient. I locked the bedroom door behind me and stepped away from it. My heart hammered against my ribs. Nothing happened for nearly 20 minutes. Then footsteps crossed the living room outside. Soft, deliberate. Something brushed lightly against the bedroom door. A scraping noise followed. The doorknob turned once, then stopped. I remained absolutely still beneath the darkness. Another scrape, then silence. The remainder of the night stretched endlessly. Sleep never arrived. Morning sunlight finally filtered through the curtains shortly after 6. The apartment looked unchanged. The front entrance remained closed. The hallway beyond appeared ordinary. Margaret listened carefully while I described the previous night's events. Theodore experienced similar escalation during his final months, she admitted. Escalation. I hated that word. What changed, I asked. Margaret hesitated. Blackwood became hungrier. The answer clarified nothing. Residents moved through the lobby carrying coffee cups and grocery bags. Ordinary lives continued despite impossible dangers. Helen approached while adjusting her cardigan. You should not remain alone upstairs anymore, she said. Why? Because Theodore stopped isolating himself near the end. Isolation made things worse. I followed Helen toward the basement archives later that afternoon. Dusty filing cabinets lined concrete walls beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Theodore stored additional records here, Helen explained. He believed the earlier incidents contained important clues. We spent hours reviewing reports spanning decades. Certain patterns repeated consistently. The crying child preceded disappearances. Hallway figures appeared before stairwell encounters. The 9th floor incidents increased every 15 years. One document caught my attention immediately. Resident statement. October 1987. Witness reported hearing multiple children laughing inside the 8th floor stairwell. Building records confirmed no juvenile residents. 3 disappearances followed within 1 week. Another report described a caretaker named Samuel Grady. He had attempted removing the rules from resident welcome packets during the 1950s. He disappeared shortly afterward. Nobody ever found him. The basement suddenly felt colder. Helen watched me carefully. Theodore never told residents everything, she said. He worried fear would spread faster than understanding. What did he hide? Helen looked away. There is another rule. My stomach tightened immediately. Theodore reserved it for caretakers only. Before Helen could continue, the basement lights flickered violently overhead. One fluorescent bulb shattered without warning. Darkness swallowed half the room instantly. Helen grabbed my arm. We need to leave. Why? Because the lights never fail down here. We hurried toward the basement exit. Footsteps echoed somewhere deeper within the archives behind us. Heavy footsteps. Slow footsteps. Neither of us turned around. The sounds continued following us until we reached the stairwell entrance. They stopped immediately afterward. Margaret stood waiting near the lobby when we emerged. Her expression hardened instantly. You went into the archives after sunset. Helen lowered her gaze. Margaret looked toward me. Theodore prohibited that for a reason. Another rule, I said quietly. Margaret nodded reluctantly. Caretakers should never enter the basement archives after dark. Why? Because something reads alongside you. That evening I returned upstairs carrying more questions than answers. Theodore's remaining letter waited inside the study. Outside, rain struck the windows steadily. Blackwood groaned softly around me. I unfolded the final page carefully. If incidents escalate beyond the established patterns, locate apartment 404. Do not enter alone. The instructions ended there. Apartment 404. The same apartment mentioned during Theodore's records. The same apartment associated with unexplained knocking decades earlier. A sudden sound interrupted my thoughts. Laughter. Faint. Childlike. Drifting from somewhere beyond the apartment entrance. My blood turned cold immediately. The laughter lasted only seconds before fading completely. Then another noise replaced it. Soft knocking. 3 deliberate taps against the front door. I remained seated inside Theodore's study. 5 knocks followed moments later. Then silence returned. Through the apartment window, Chicago continued moving beneath gray evening skies. Traffic lights changed. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks. Normal life existed only stories below. Inside Blackwood Apartments, normality had become something fragile, something temporary. I unfolded Theodore's letter once more. One final sentence occupied the bottom margin in hurried handwriting. If apartment 404 ever becomes occupied again, leave Blackwood immediately. The problem is that apartment 404 has remained empty since 1987. A sharp voice echoed suddenly through the hallway outside. Ethan, open the door. It was Margaret's voice. Then came 3 measured knocks against the apartment entrance. My phone buzzed simultaneously. A message from Margaret appeared across the screen. Do not open your door tonight. I am still downstairs. I stared at the message on my phone while another 3 knocks echoed through Theodore's apartment. Margaret's voice waited beyond the front entrance. Calm. Familiar. Wrong. My thumb hovered over the screen. A second message appeared immediately after. Do not answer anyone calling from the hallway tonight. Stay inside until morning. I backed away from the door slowly. Another voice joined Margaret's. Ethan. It was Helen. You need to let us in. The fear settling through my stomach felt different now. Less uncertain. More focused. Blackwood had taught me that familiar things could become dangerous. The apartment remained silent after the voices stopped. I stayed inside Theodore's study until exhaustion finally dragged me into restless sleep. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows several hours later. The hallway outside appeared ordinary again. Margaret sat behind the management office desk when I arrived downstairs. She looked up immediately. You listened to the messages, she said. I nodded. Who was outside my door? Margaret removed her glasses carefully. We do not know. The answer unsettled me more than I expected. I spent the morning helping maintenance workers repair plumbing issues on the 3rd floor. The ordinary routine offered temporary relief. Residents complained about leaking faucets. Somebody needed a replacement refrigerator. Life inside Blackwood continued despite its impossible rules. Around lunchtime, Helen approached carrying another container of homemade soup. She lowered herself carefully into the chair opposite mine. Theodore found something before he died, she said quietly. Something involving apartment 404. I set my spoon aside. What kind of something? Helen hesitated. A pattern. The incidents grew stronger whenever somebody approached that apartment. Margaret believes the apartment should remain sealed forever. Theodore disagreed. Why? Because Theodore believed understanding offered the only chance of ending this. Helen reached into her purse and removed a brass key attached to faded ribbon. Apartment 404. Margaret cannot know about this. I stared at the key resting between us. Everything inside me argued against accepting it. Then I remembered Theodore's letters. Apartment 404 occupied the center of every warning. I slipped the key into my pocket. That evening, rain covered Chicago once again. The building settled into familiar nighttime routines. Televisions flickered behind closed doors. Elevators carried residents between floors. Somewhere nearby, somebody practiced piano scales imperfectly. I waited until shortly after 10 before leaving Theodore's apartment. The 4th floor hallway appeared identical to every other level inside Blackwood. Beige wallpaper. framed paintings, soft lighting. Apartment 404 waited near the far end. Unlike neighboring units, its door lacked decorative touches. No welcome mat. No holiday decorations. Just dark wood and silence. My footsteps slowed instinctively. Theodore had spent decades investigating Blackwood. Even he approached this apartment cautiously. I removed the brass key from my pocket. The metal felt unusually cold against my fingertips. Before I could insert it, footsteps approached from behind. Ethan. Margaret's voice echoed through the hallway. I turned automatically. Margaret stood several feet away carrying maintenance paperwork. Relief flooded my chest immediately. Then confusion followed. Margaret had mentioned an appointment with contractors across town earlier that afternoon. "What are you doing here?" I asked. Margaret stopped walking. Her expression remained neutral, checking the building. Her answer arrived too quickly. Something inside me tightened. I remembered the text message from the previous night. Familiar voices could not always be trusted. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Open the apartment, Ethan." Theodore left important records inside. Her smile widened gradually. Too gradual. Every instinct urged retreat. Instead, I stepped backward carefully. Margaret's expression flattened instantly. "Ethan," she repeated. "Open the apartment." I backed farther away. The hallway lights flickered overhead. Margaret remained perfectly still. Then another voice echoed from the elevator entrance behind me. "Ethan." The real Margaret hurried toward us carrying grocery bags. She froze immediately. "Do not speak to her," Margaret shouted. The woman standing beside apartment 404 turned slowly. Her face remained identical. Everything else changed. The smile stretched wider than human anatomy allowed. I stumbled backward. Margaret grabbed my arm. "Run." We sprinted toward the elevator. Behind us, footsteps followed without urgency. Slow, confident. Margaret pressed repeatedly against the elevator button. Nothing happened. The footsteps continued approaching. "Stairwell," Margaret ordered. We burst through the emergency exit moments before the footsteps reached us. Margaret slammed the door behind us. Silence followed instantly. Neither of us spoke until reaching the second-floor landing. Margaret leaned heavily against the wall. Theodore encountered her twice before his death, Margaret admitted. Her, the thing borrowing familiar faces. It learns. I struggled catching my breath. Apartment 404. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Whatever resides there extends beyond the apartment itself. Theodore believed the sealed unit acted as an anchor. If somebody opens it permanently, the rules may stop protecting us. The statement settled heavily between us. Back upstairs, I locked Theodore's apartment immediately. Margaret agreed to explain everything she knew. Years ago, a family occupied apartment 404. Parents, 2 daughters. Neighbors described them as ordinary. Then the incidents intensified rapidly. Residents heard children crying despite strict occupancy policies. Hallway figures appeared nightly. Several disappearances followed. One winter evening, the family vanished completely. Apartment 404 remained empty afterward. The rules developed gradually during the following decades. Theodore documented them carefully. Why did he investigate further? I asked. Because Theodore believed Blackwood could not sustain itself indefinitely. Margaret glanced toward the apartment windows. The intervals between incidents shortened every year. Residents obeyed because they feared consequences. Theodore wanted understanding. Night settled across Chicago while Margaret spoke. Around 11, she prepared to leave. Stay inside tonight, she warned. Tomorrow we search Theodore's remaining records. I locked the door behind her departure. Theodore's final notebooks occupied the study desk. One journal described construction records dating back nearly a century. Blackwood Apartments had replaced an earlier structure destroyed by fire. Another journal contained hand-drawn maps. Hidden maintenance passages connected various sections of the building. Several routes led toward apartment 404. Midnight approached quietly. Outside, rain had finally stopped. I studied Theodore's notes carefully. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout multiple journals. The caretaker must witness the threshold. The phrase made little sense. Another notebook provided additional context. Apartment 404 does not contain the source. It contains the entrance. A sharp knock interrupted my reading. 3 measured taps against the apartment door. My pulse quickened immediately. 5 knocks followed seconds later. I rose from the study desk automatic. The bedroom offered temporary safety according to the rules. Then another sound reached me. Faint, childlike laughter drifting through the ventilation system. The laughter moved gradually closer. I hurried toward Theodore's bedroom. Halfway there, the apartment lights flickered violently. Darkness swallowed the hallway. The laughter stopped. Complete silence followed. My phone flashlight illuminated narrow sections of the apartment while I continued toward the bedroom. Another voice emerged behind me. Ethan, my brother's voice. Fear tightened around my lungs instantly. Ethan, please help me. The voice sounded desperate, painfully real. I remembered the stairwell rule. Familiar voices after midnight could not be trusted. I continued walking without responding. The bedroom door waited only several feet away. Ethan. This time the voice belonged to my former wife. You cannot keep running forever. My hand found the bedroom doorknob. Ethan. Theodore's voice echoed softly from the darkness behind me. You need to turn around. You need to see this. The temptation nearly overwhelmed me. Theodore represented answers, guidance, understanding. Then I remembered Margaret's warning. It learns. I entered the bedroom immediately and locked the door behind me. Something struck the opposite side almost instantly. Once, twice. Then silence returned. I remained seated against the bedroom wall until sunrise illuminated the room once more. Morning brought another message beneath Theodore's study door. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Margaret. Meet me in the basement archives at noon. We found Theodore's final map. Apartment 404 is not where he expected the threshold to open. It is where he planned to close it. Shortly before noon, I carried Theodore's journals downstairs toward the basement archives. Every resident I passed looked exhausted. Dark circles framed their eyes. Conversations remained subdued. Blackwood felt different. Tighter somehow. As though the building itself anticipated something approaching. Margaret waited beside the archive entrance, holding a large blueprint tube beneath one arm. Helen stood nearby clutching a thermos with trembling hands. Neither woman attempted small talk. Margaret unrolled Theodore's final map across an old maintenance table. Several sections had been annotated repeatedly. Theodore identified hidden passageways beneath the original foundation. Margaret explained. The building expanded several times throughout its history. Older structures became incorporated into newer construction. My gaze settled upon one specific notation, threshold chamber. The words had been circled aggressively. Apartment 404 sits directly above this location. Margaret continued. Theodore believed the apartment functioned as a seal rather than a source. Helen looked visibly uncomfortable. Theodore intended to close whatever remained beneath Blackwood permanently. I studied the map carefully. A maintenance corridor extended beneath the basement archives. The route terminated below apartment 404. When did Theodore plan this? I asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses. During his final weeks. He believed conditions had deteriorated beyond recovery. Why did he stop? Neither woman answered immediately. Finally, Helen spoke softly. Because Theodore disappeared before completing his preparations. Silence followed. I remembered Theodore's empty apartment. His neatly organized study. The unfinished letters addressed to me. He had expected failure. Margaret rolled the blueprint closed. Theodore left instructions. If escalation continued, the caretaker must descend beneath Blackwood. Alone. I stared at her. Absolutely not. Margaret nodded slowly. Theodore expected that reaction. Unfortunately, the rules surrounding the threshold remained incomplete. Helen folded her hands tightly together. We are running out of time. During the afternoon, Margaret guided me through additional records. Theodore had hidden throughout Blackwood. Several described previous caretakers. None remained longer than 30 years. Most vanished under unexplained circumstances. Theodore survived nearly 4 decades. According to his journals, the rules changed gradually. New occurrences emerged without warning. Older protections weakened. The crying children appeared more frequently. The hallway figures lingered longer. Stairwell incidents expanded beyond their traditional patterns. Blackwood was evolving. Around 6 in the evening, residents gathered informally within the lobby. Anxiety permeated every conversation. Somebody reported hearing children's laughter during daylight hours. Another resident described elevator malfunctions involving impossible floor numbers. Margaret addressed the gathering calmly. Theodore prepared for difficult periods like this. She reminded everyone, follow established precautions. Avoid unnecessary travel after dark. Notify management immediately regarding unusual incidents. Nobody questioned her authority. Fear had transformed the impossible into routine. Later that evening, I returned upstairs carrying Theodore's final journal beneath my arm. Rain hammered against the windows once more. Chicago disappeared behind shifting curtains of water. Theodore's handwriting filled the remaining pages. The threshold responds differently to each caretaker. It reflects vulnerabilities, regrets, unresolved grief. Never assume what you witness represents objective reality. The statement unsettled me profoundly. Theodore had understood psychological manipulation intimately. Another entry described a previous caretaker encountering deceased relatives within Blackwood's hallways. The encounters intensified until the caretaker willingly entered apartment 404. Nobody saw him again. A sudden knock interrupted my reading. 3 measured taps echoed through Theodore's apartment. My muscles tightened immediately. 5 knocks followed moments later. I ignored them completely. The rules had become instinctive. Several minutes passed before silence returned. Then my telephone vibrated unexpectedly. My younger brother's name illuminated the screen. Relief flooded through me instantly. I answered cautiously, "Ethan, thank God. I have been trying to reach you all day." His voice sounded genuine, familiar. "How are things in Milwaukee?" I asked carefully. "Snow this morning." "Why?" I relaxed slightly. Chicago experienced rain rather than snow. The detail matched reality. My brother hesitated. "Ethan, somebody called me from your number last night." Cold unease settled through my stomach immediately. "What did they say?" "They sounded exactly like you. They kept asking whether I remembered the apartment building." I gripped the telephone tighter. "What apartment building?" "Blackwood Apartments." The call ended abruptly afterward. My brother exhaled shakily. "Ethan, what exactly is happening out there?" I glanced toward Theodore's study doorway. "I wish I knew." We spoke briefly before ending the conversation. Another boundary had fallen. Whatever existed inside Blackwood had reached beyond its walls. Sleep remained elusive that night. Shortly after midnight, I heard footsteps crossing the hallway outside Theodore's apartment. Slow, deliberate, not unusual anymore. Then came something new. Multiple voices speaking simultaneously, none loud enough to distinguish individual words. The conversation drifted gradually along the corridor. Curiosity battled common sense. Eventually, caution prevailed. I remained inside Theodore's apartment until sunrise. Morning brought alarming news. Margaret waited outside my apartment with visible exhaustion etched across her features. "We lost contact with Thomas from apartment 712 overnight," she said quietly. Thomas, the middle-aged resident carrying grocery bags. "When did anybody last see him?" "Around 10 yesterday evening. Helen reported hearing voices outside his apartment shortly after midnight." I remembered Theodore's journals describing escalating patterns. Residents had disappeared before. Margaret handed me a folded note recovered from Thomas's kitchen table. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Thomas himself. The stairwell voice sounded exactly like my daughter. "I know the rules. I know better. But if there is even a chance she needs help, how can I ignore it?" My throat tightened painfully. Thomas had lost his daughter years earlier, according to Helen. Blackwood exploited grief mercilessly. The discovery strengthened my resolve. Theodore had sacrificed decades attempting containment. I could not simply abandon Blackwood. That afternoon, Margaret unlocked a concealed maintenance passage Theodore frequently used. Narrow corridors stretched behind Blackwood's visible walls. Pipes lined aging concrete surfaces. Hidden observation points overlooked critical areas throughout the building. Theodore monitored incidents from these locations. Margaret explained. The passages eventually descended toward lower levels beneath the basement. Theodore's threshold chamber lay somewhere ahead. Margaret stopped beside an aging steel door reinforced with additional locks. Beyond this point, Theodore insisted the caretaker proceed alone. Why? Because the threshold adapts according to individual perception. Theodore believed additional observers increased unpredictability. I stared toward the reinforced entrance. Fear pressed heavily against my ribs. Theodore had faced this place repeatedly. Eventually, it consumed him. I stepped away reluctantly. Not tonight. Margaret nodded approvingly. Fear encourages preparation. Overconfidence kills caretakers. Back upstairs, I spent hours reviewing Theodore's remaining journals. One entry stood apart from the others. If you reach the threshold chamber, remember this. The building wants acknowledgement. Recognition grants influence. Denial preserves distance. Do not answer questions. Do not accept invitations. Most importantly, do not follow familiar faces. Evening settled quietly across Blackwood. Residents remained behind locked doors. Rain finally ceased outside. Around 11, Helen delivered additional supplies to Theodore's apartment. Flashlights, batteries, bottled water. Theodore always prepared extensively before descending, she explained. She hesitated near the entrance. Ethan. Theodore blamed himself for many losses. Do not carry his guilt unnecessarily. After Helen departed, I organized the supplies carefully. Midnight approached gradually. Then the apartment lights failed without warning. Darkness consumed Theodore's living room instantly. My flashlight illuminated only fragments of familiar surroundings. A child's laughter echoed faintly through the ventilation system. Another laugh answered from somewhere beyond the apartment entrance. Then came crying, soft, desperate, moving slowly through the hallway outside. I remained perfectly still. The crying intensified briefly before fading completely. Minutes later, my telephone vibrated once more. Margaret's name appeared across the screen. Ethan. Residents reported activity surrounding apartment 404. Multiple sightings. Several voices. We need you downstairs immediately. I gathered Theodore's journals and emergency supplies without hesitation. The elevator remained functional initially. Then it stopped unexpectedly between floors. The display flickered uncertainly. 8, 9, 8 again. My breathing quickened. Blackwood only contained 8 floors. Theodore's warning surfaced immediately. If the elevator stops at the 9th floor, do not exit. Keep your eyes lowered until the doors close. The elevator shuddered violently. The display settled upon 9. The doors slid open slowly. I lowered my gaze immediately toward the floor. Cold air drifted inward from the impossible corridor beyond. Silence lingered momentarily. Then footsteps approached from outside the elevator. Bare feet crossing unseen carpet. They stopped directly before the threshold. A familiar voice spoke softly. Ethan. It belonged to Thomas from apartment 712. I found my daughter. You need to see this. I kept my eyes fixed downward. Another pair of footsteps approached. Then another. Additional voices joined Thomas's. Theodore. My former wife. My younger brother. Helen. Margaret. All speaking gently, patiently, inviting me outward. The elevator doors remained open far longer than normal. Eventually, another voice emerged from the impossible corridor. A child's voice. Ethan, please look at me. The elevator finally lurched downward without warning. The doors closed abruptly. Silence returned immediately. When the elevator reached the lobby moments later, Margaret stood waiting with visible relief. Her expression darkened upon seeing my face. The 9th floor, she asked quietly. I nodded once. Margaret inhaled slowly. Then Blackwood is running out of time. Theodore feared this stage would arrive eventually. She glanced toward the basement corridor beyond the lobby. Tomorrow night, you descend to the threshold chamber, because if the 9th floor has awakened, apartment 404 will not remain closed much longer. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of dirty dishwater. I stood inside Theodora's kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Sleep had become something theoretical inside Blackwood Apartments. The 9th floor had changed everything. Theodora's journals lay spread across the table beside handwritten notes and maintenance maps. The threshold chamber waited beneath the building. So did whatever Theodore had spent decades trying to contain. Margaret arrived shortly after 8 carrying a cardboard box filled with supplies. Flashlights, first aid equipment, spare batteries. She set everything onto the counter without speaking. Eventually, she looked toward me. Theodore postponed this journey for years. I folded Theodore's final journal shut. Did he ever explain why? Margaret hesitated. Because every caretaker who descended before him disappeared. The statement settled heavily between us. Outside the apartment windows, Chicago continued its ordinary rhythm. Car horns echoed below. People hurried toward jobs and appointments. Nobody walking those sidewalks understood what existed beneath Blackwood Apartments. The contrast made my stomach tighten. Around noon, Helen joined us with sandwiches from the diner nearby. Nobody seemed hungry. We ate anyway. Theodore insisted on maintaining routines during difficult periods. Helen explained softly, "Normal life matters. It reminds us why survival matters." By late afternoon, residents began gathering quietly inside the lobby. Word had spread regarding the elevator incident. Fear lingered behind every conversation. Thomas had vanished. Others reported hearing familiar voices outside apartment doors overnight. Margaret addressed everyone calmly. Remain inside your apartments after dark. Ignore unfamiliar sounds. Follow established precautions. A middle-aged woman near the elevators raised trembling hands. What happens if the rules stop working? Margaret remained silent for several seconds. Then she answered honestly, "We do everything Theodore taught us." Evening arrived gradually. Rain tapped gently against Blackwood's windows once again. Shortly after 10, Margaret led me toward the hidden maintenance corridors beneath the basement. Helen remained behind. Somebody must oversee the residents, she insisted. Theodore's flashlight illuminated the narrow passage ahead while Margaret followed several steps behind. Concrete walls pressed inward tightly. Rusted pipes lined the ceiling overhead. Theodore traveled this route frequently during his final years. Margaret explained. We walked for nearly 20 minutes before reaching the reinforced steel door described within Theodore's journals. Several heavy locks secured its surface. Margaret removed a ring of keys from her pocket. Theodore left these instructions specifically for you. One by one, the locks disengaged. Cold air drifted outward immediately. The passage beyond descended steeply into darkness. Margaret touched my shoulder. Remember Theodore's warnings. Do not answer questions. Do not acknowledge familiar faces. If the threshold offers comfort, refuse it. I tightened my grip upon Theodore's journal. What if I fail? Margaret's expression softened. Then Blackwood loses its caretaker. I descended alone. The staircase spiraled deeper beneath the city. Eventually, electrical lighting disappeared entirely. My flashlight illuminated ancient stone replacing modern concrete. Theodore's notes described original foundations predating Blackwood itself. The air smelled damp and metallic. Several minutes later, the staircase opened into a vast underground chamber. My flashlight revealed brick archways disappearing into darkness. At the chamber's center stood a weathered iron door. Symbols covered its surface. None resembled recognizable languages. Theodore's journal contained one final instruction. Witness the threshold. Do not cross it. I approached carefully. Halfway across the chamber, a familiar voice echoed softly behind me. Ethan, my younger brother's voice. I continued walking. Ethan, please, I need your help. The voice sounded painfully genuine. I remembered Milwaukee. Oil stains across the driveway. Cheap coffee before dawn. My brother offering his couch without complaint. I kept moving. Another voice emerged nearby. My former wife. Ethan, we can fix everything. You just have to listen. The iron door remained 20 feet ahead. Then Theodore spoke. Ethan, you misunderstood my journals. You need to open the threshold completely. I stopped walking briefly. Theodore had become guidance throughout recent weeks. Then I remembered Margaret's warning. It learns. I resumed moving forward. The chamber grew colder with each step. The iron door began vibrating softly. Something moved beyond it. A child's laughter drifted outward through narrow gaps surrounding the frame. Then crying followed. Soft, heartbroken, multiple voices layered together. I reached the threshold finally. Theodore's final note instructed me to observe carefully. Symbols carved across the iron surface had changed. Fresh scratches formed unfamiliar words repeatedly. Open the door. The chamber darkened abruptly. My flashlight flickered uncertainly. Footsteps approached from behind. Bare feet against stone. I refused to turn around. Ethan. The child's voice sounded close enough to touch. Please let us out. Another voice joined it. Then another. Thomas. Helen. Margaret. Theodore. My father. The chamber filled with familiar voices. Grief became a weapon. Memory became bait. I focused upon Theodore's journal instead. One passage stood apart from everything else. The threshold does not imprison victims. It imprisons hunger. Understanding crashed through me instantly. Blackwood was never cursed. Blackwood was containment. The rules existed because somebody long ago discovered survival required patterns. The iron door shook violently. Cracks spread across surrounding stonework. The threshold was weakening. Theodore's disappearance suddenly made horrifying sense. He had attempted repairs alone. A maintenance bag rested beside the threshold wall. Theodore's final tools remained untouched nearby. He had expected another caretaker eventually. Additional instructions accompanied the equipment. Reinforce the anchors during active manifestation. Do not engage directly. I moved quickly. Iron braces secured surrounding mechanisms into place. Rusted bolts required replacement. The chamber trembled repeatedly while voices screamed throughout the darkness behind me. My father's voice called desperately for help. My former wife begged forgiveness. Thomas pleaded about his missing daughter. I ignored every word. The final anchor required manual adjustment beside the threshold itself. The iron door pulsed beneath my fingertips. Cold flooded upward through my arm instantly. Images flashed across my thoughts. Endless hallways. Children laughing within impossible apartments. Theodore kneeling alone before the threshold decades earlier. I tightened the final mechanism. The chamber shook violently. Then silence arrived. Complete silence. The iron door stopped moving. The carvings across its surface faded gradually. I stumbled backward, breathing heavily. Theodore's journal slipped from my grasp. One final handwritten message had appeared beneath earlier notes. Good. You listened. Tears blurred my vision unexpectedly. Theodore had known he might fail. He had prepared anyway. The return journey felt endless. Margaret waited anxiously beyond the reinforced doorway. Her expression shifted immediately upon seeing my face. Did it work? I nodded slowly. For now, we climbed toward the basement together. Halfway up the staircase, distant laughter echoed faintly through Blackwood's foundations. Margaret stopped walking. The threshold stabilized, she said quietly. Then why can we still hear them? Neither of us answered. Back inside the lobby, residents emerged cautiously from apartments. Helen embraced Margaret tightly. Somebody turned on music near the mailboxes. Ordinary conversations resumed gradually. Relief spread carefully through Blackwood apartments. Yet, Theodore's final message continued haunting my thoughts. Good? You listened. Not goodbye. Not congratulations. Simply acknowledgement. Late that night, I returned alone to Theodore's apartment. Chicago shimmered beyond rain-streaked windows. Theodore's journals occupied their familiar place upon the study desk. Exhaustion settled heavily through my bones. Then came a soft knock against the front door. 3 measured taps. I froze immediately. Silence followed. Then another sequence. 5 deliberate knocks. I remained seated inside Theodore's study. The knocking stopped. Several minutes passed. Eventually, Footsteps crossed the hallway outside. Slow, barefoot, retreating toward the elevators. My telephone vibrated moments later. A text message from Margaret appeared across the screen. The elevator stopped at the 9th floor again tonight. Nobody was inside. The message ended there. I stared toward Theodore's journals, while distant laughter echoed faintly through Blackwood's ventilation system. The threshold had held. The building remained standing. But deep beneath Blackwood Apartments, something had noticed that Theodore's successor had finally arrived. The following week felt almost normal. That frightened me more than anything else. Residents returned to familiar routines. The elevators behaved properly. No disappearances occurred. Nobody reported voices in the stairwells. Even the crying children seemed to have vanished. Blackwood Apartments settled into a fragile imitation of peace. Every morning, I reviewed maintenance requests over coffee. Every afternoon, I walked the hallways checking on residents. People smiled more often. Conversations lasted longer. Hope had returned. Theodore's journals remained open on my desk regardless. I trusted peace less than Theodore ever had. 3 weeks after my descent into the threshold chamber, Margaret knocked on my office door, carrying an old cardboard box. "We found these inside Theodore's storage unit," she explained. The contents included photographs, maintenance records, and several journals I had never seen before. One photograph immediately caught my attention. Theodore stood beside another man outside Blackwood Apartments. The picture appeared decades old. I flipped it over. A handwritten note covered the back. Theodore and Samuel. Final inspection before closure attempt. Closure attempt. My stomach tightened. Samuel, the caretaker who disappeared during the 1950s. I opened Theodore's newly discovered journal immediately. Samuel believed the threshold could be destroyed. He was wrong. The threshold cannot be destroyed because it is not the source. It is the lock. I continued reading. Every caretaker eventually reaches the same conclusion. Blackwood is not containing something beneath the building. Blackwood is containing something inside itself. The words unsettled me profoundly. Theodore's previous journals described containment. These pages described imprisonment. There was a difference. A dangerous difference. That evening, I sat alone inside Theodore's apartment studying the remaining entries. Several pages had been damaged deliberately. Entire sections had been removed. Theodore rarely censored his own work. The missing information troubled me. Around midnight, my telephone vibrated unexpectedly. "Margaret. Ethan. Come downstairs." Her voice sounded strained. "We have a problem." Minutes later, I entered the lobby. Margaret stood beside the elevators. Helen remained nearby. Both women looked pale. "What happened?" Margaret pointed upward silently. The elevator display above the doors read 9. My pulse quickened instantly. Nobody was inside. Nobody had called it. Yet the display remained fixed on the impossible floor. Then the elevator descended slowly. 9, 8, 7, 6. The doors opened moments later. Empty. Completely empty. Helen crossed herself instinctively. Theodore never saw it stay visible this long. The display continued showing 9 even after the doors closed again. We watched silently. Nobody slept much that night. The following evening brought worse news. Several residents reported seeing lights inside apartment 404. Margaret inspected the unit personally. The apartment remained locked, empty, yet multiple witnesses described movement behind the curtains. Blackwood was changing again. 3 nights later, the first voice returned. A resident named Carla reported hearing her deceased husband calling from the stairwell. Fortunately, she remembered the rules. She ignored him. The pattern continued escalating afterward. More voices, more sightings, more impossible elevator activity. The threshold chamber remained stable according to Theodore's instruments. Yet Blackwood itself felt increasingly restless. One rainy evening, I returned to the hidden maintenance corridors alone. Theodore had spent decades searching for answers. Perhaps he had hidden something important. Hours passed beneath the building. Dust coated every surface. Old pipes rattled softly overhead. Eventually, I discovered a concealed compartment behind a loose brick wall. Inside rested a sealed envelope. My name appeared across the front. Ethan, if you found this letter, then my repairs failed exactly as expected. I sat down immediately. Theodore's final message continued across several pages. The threshold is not the prison. The caretakers are. Each caretaker becomes part of the containment over time. We reinforce the lock because the building slowly absorbs us. Samuel learned the truth first. He attempted escape. Blackwood followed him. Fear settled heavily through my chest. Theodore continued. If conditions worsen after your descent, there remains one final option. The building must receive a new foundation, a new caretaker. I lowered the pages slowly. Theodore had known exactly what awaited me. The realization felt devastating. A sudden noise interrupted my thoughts. Footsteps. Slow footsteps approaching through the maintenance corridor. I rose immediately. The flashlight beam illuminated empty darkness ahead. Then somebody stepped into view. Theodore. Not a memory, not an illusion glimpsed briefly. Theodore stood 20 feet away, exactly as he appeared within old photographs. Gray hair, thin frame, calm expression. Ethan, he said softly. My heart hammered violently. Theodore. He shook his head. Do not answer questions. Do not accept invitations. The words came directly from Theodore's journals. Then I understood. The figure before me smiled sadly. Good. You remembered. The image dissolved instantly. Darkness returned. I left the maintenance corridors immediately. The next morning, another resident vanished. Helen. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle. No evidence. Nothing. Only a handwritten note resting beside her kitchen sink. I followed the voices. Panic spread through Blackwood rapidly afterward. Residents packed belongings. Some attempted moving out immediately. Most returned within hours. Every road somehow led back. Theodore's warning finally made sense. Physical departure meant nothing. Blackwood followed its caretakers. It followed its residents. The building existed beyond brick and steel. A week later, Margaret arrived carrying Helen's journal. We found this hidden beneath her mattress. The final entry had been written hours before her disappearance. The children are appearing during daylight now. They are no longer asking people to follow them. They are looking for someone. The caretaker. I finished reading silently. Margaret stared toward the lobby windows. Theodore believed the building would eventually choose a successor. I already am the successor, I replied. Margaret looked at me carefully. Perhaps not the final one. Winter arrived gradually across Chicago. Snow covered the streets. Holiday decorations appeared throughout nearby buildings. Blackwood apartments continued standing. Residents continued surviving. Yet every rule required increasing vigilance. The crying children returned nightly. The hallway figure lingered longer than before. The 9th floor appeared almost every evening. One December night, nearly a year after inheriting Blackwood, I stood alone inside Theodore's apartment, watching snow fall beyond the windows. My life in Milwaukee felt impossibly distant. The divorce, the unemployment, the couch inside my brother's house. Those problems belonged to somebody else now. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. 3 measured taps. Then 5. I ignored them automatically. Some habits become survival. My telephone buzzed moments later. A photograph appeared from an unknown number. The image showed Blackwood apartments beneath summer sunlight. Theodore stood outside the entrance. Beside him stood Samuel. Beside Samuel stood another caretaker I did not recognize. Behind all 3 men, somebody watched from a 9th floor window. The figure looked directly into the camera. Directly at me. A second message arrived immediately afterward. Just 6 words. We are still holding the door. I stared at the screen for a very long time. Outside, snow continued falling across Chicago. Inside Blackwood apartments, footsteps crossed distant hallways. Somewhere below, an elevator traveled briefly to the 9th floor before descending again. The building remained standing. The rules remained necessary. And every night before sleeping, I still listened carefully for children crying beyond my apartment door. because Theodore had been right about one thing. Blackwood did not create the horror. It contained it. The truly frightening part was never what lived beneath the building. The truly frightening part was knowing the lock would eventually need another caretaker. One day somebody else would receive a telephone call from a lawyer. Somebody else would inherit a building they never asked for. Somebody else would step through Blackwood's front entrance, believing their life was finally improving. And when that day came, I hoped they would find Theodore's journals. Because if they did not, the door on the 9th floor might finally open. And if that happened, nobody inside Blackwood Apartments would ever need rules again.